Okay, let's dive in. Today we're doing something a bit specific. We're taking a deep dive into this set of lecture notes you shared.
Right.
These are from Jae Choi, an associate professor over at George Washington University. And they really lay out non-experimental research design
Mhm.
and the methods used for collecting data in those kinds of studies.
Yeah, the fundamentals.
Exactly. Our mission here is pretty straightforward. Let's try to cut through some of the academic jargon,
Mm.
pull out the absolute must-know concepts, and really help you get a quick handle on this area of research methods,
hmm
like building your own little detector for studies that aren't, full-blown experiments.
And that detector is so important. I mean, the research design itself, it really dictates what you can actually conclude from a study.
Right.
And these non-experimental methods, they're everywhere,
Yeah.
especially in fields like education, social sciences, places where you often just can't run a true experiment ethically or practically.
Yeah.
So understanding their strengths and maybe more importantly, their weaknesses is just key if you want to be smart about the information you consume.
Okay, so let's unpack that first big question then.
Yeah.
Based on these notes, what is non-experimental research? Like, what really sets it apart?
Well, the absolute key difference is the researcher doesn't control the main variables.
No control.
Right. You're not creating different situations. You're not manipulating anything to see what happens. And crucially, no random assignment. You're not putting people into different groups randomly.
Ah,
And that's just the reality in so many fields. Think about variables like, well, sex, intelligence, aptitude, socioeconomic status, SES, the notes call it.
yeah.
You can't assign those things to people for a study. It's not possible, not ethical. So you study people as they are with those characteristics already in place.
So it's more about observing things after they've already happened, looking at how existing stuff relates to outcomes.
Precisely. The notes link it directly to ex post facto research,
Ex post facto.
which, yeah, literally means after the fact. You're looking at relationships or differences that are already out there.
Gotcha. I saw a visual in the notes, too, that puts non-experimental on a kind of spectrum,
Yeah.
with quasi-experimental and true experiments. Does thinking about it that way help?
Oh, definitely. That spectrum idea is great because it highlights this constant trade-off
A trade-off between what?
between feasibility, how easy it is to actually do the research, and validity, specifically internal validity.
Internal validity.
Oh,
Remind me.
that's your confidence that the thing you think is causing the effect, your independent variable, is really the cause and not something else entirely.
Okay.
So, non-experimental, usually high on feasibility, easier, often uses existing data,
Yeah.
but generally lower on that internal validity. You can't be as sure about cause and effect.
Compared to a true experiment.
Exactly. A true experiment with manipulation and random assignment, that's the gold standard for internal validity. You control for those other things, but often very low on feasibility.
Yeah.
Think about that smoking and lung cancer example. The perfect experiment would assign people to smoke or not. Super high validity in theory.
But impossible. And totally unethical.
Totally. So you have to study it ex post facto. Feasible, yes, but claiming direct causation, much harder. Because you haven't controlled for everything else going on in people's lives.
Okay, that really clarifies it. You can study complex real-world things, but you lose that tight control you need to really nail down cause and effect.
That's the heart of it. You see correlations, associations, but proving causation is the tricky part.
So the notes then break down this ex post facto research into a couple of types. What are the main ones we should look at?
The two big ones discussed under ex post facto designs are correlational research and causal comparative research.
Okay.
The notes also bring up survey research here, but they make a point of saying, look, surveys are super common in these designs, but a survey itself is more of a data collection method.
Right. Tool versus the overall plan. Got it. So let's start with correlational. What does that involve?
Correlational research is all about looking for relationships or associations between variables just as they naturally exist.
So no interfering.
Nope. The researcher just observes and measures things. They're not trying to change anything or assign people to groups, just seeing if variables tend to move together.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The notes mention measuring anxiety levels and depression levels in a group. Do people with higher anxiety also tend to report higher depression? You're not causing either one.
Measuring and seeing if there's a link.
Exactly. And that's where statistics like correlation analysis come in. You get coefficients, like Pearson's are, that tell you how strong the relationship is and whether it's positive or negative.
Okay.
The notes also mention a study by Abbott, White, and Charles about personal values and commitment to an organization. Same idea, measure both, see if they're related.
Okay. So correlational Are things linked? And how strongly? Now, here's where I sometimes get a bit fuzzy. How is causal comparative different? Sounds similar.
Yeah, this raises an important question. They do sound alike. The key difference is that in causal comparative research, the researcher comes in with a theory, a hypothesis about which variable might be the independent variable, the cause, and which is the dependent, the effect.
Even though they can't actually manipulate that cause.
Precisely.
Mhm.
Let's use the smoking example again. In a causal comparative study, you'd compare a group of existing smokers to a group of existing non-smokers.
Okay.
And then you'd look at their rates of lung cancer. Your theory is that smoking, the presumed independent variable, influences lung cancer, the presumed dependent variable. You're comparing groups based on that pre-existing difference.
Because you couldn't randomly assign them to smoke or not?
Exactly. And connecting this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
that lack of random assignment is the weak spot for causal claims.
Right.
People who choose to smoke might be different from non-smokers in lots of other ways, right?
Right.
Diet, lifestyle, genetics, stuff that could also influence lung cancer.
So how do researchers deal with that?
Well, the notes mention using statistical control, trying to account for those other factors statistically.
Ah, okay.
Like the example of parental SES and student achievement, you might think SES affects achievement, so you compare students from different SES backgrounds. But you know other things matter too, like maybe school quality or parental involvement.
Yeah.
So you measure those things as well and use statistical techniques to try and sort of level the playing field or control for their influence when looking at the SES achievement link. It helps, but it's not the same as the control you get in an experiment.
So the takeaway is correlational just says A and B seem linked. Causal comparative says A and B are linked, and I think A might influence B, but you need that big asterisk because you didn't control everything else.
You got it. You're comparing based on what's already there, hinting at a direction, but without that experimental certainty. Always ask, what else could be going on?
Okay, that distinction is really helpful. Now, beyond the type of study, the notes also talk about collecting data over time. That seems like another layer.
Oh, absolutely. When you collect data and how often hugely impacts what you can actually learn, especially about change.
So what are the main approaches there?
Well, first, there's the census, trying to survey absolutely everyone in a population at one specific point. Big undertaking.
Right.
But for studying samples over time, the two main designs discussed are cross-sectional and longitudinal.
Okay, cross-sectional first. What's the idea there?
Cross-sectional is like taking a snapshot. You collect data from your sample, or maybe multiple samples representing different groups, at just one point in time.
A snapshot.
Yeah. It's great for describing what a population looks like right now, or for comparing different groups, like different age groups, at that specific moment.
Like the example in the notes.
Exactly. Surveying math achievement in grades 10, 11, and 12 all at the same time. You can see if, say, average scores are higher in 12th grade than 10th at that moment.
And this seems important.
Yes, the huge limitation, and this is crucial for you as someone reading research. You cannot use a cross-sectional study to measure change in individuals.
Why not?
Because you survey different kids in each grade. You see a difference between the 10th graders and the 12th graders today, but you have no idea if any individual student's score actually went up or down as they moved from 10th to 12th grade.
Okay, so snapshot of group differences now, but nothing about individual journeys.
Right.
What about longitudinal then? That sounds like it does track individuals.
Yes, that's the whole point. Longitudinal studies, which the notes also call panel studies sometimes.
Battle studies.
So they collect data from the exact same sample of individuals multiple times over a period. At least twice, usually more.
Ah, okay. Same people, different times.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here, the real power, is that because you're following the same people, you can study individual change, how individuals develop or shift over time.
Like the example they gave.
Yeah, the GWU graduates. Tracking the same 100 grads from the class of 2013, asking about their attitudes toward donating in 2014, 2016, 2018. You can actually see if individuals became more or less positive over those years.
That makes total sense. You can really see evolution.
Hmm.
But the notes flag some downsides too. What are the catches?
The big one is attrition.
Attrition.
People dropping out of the study over time. If it's a long study, it's almost guaranteed some people will move or lose interest or just become unreachable.
And that's a problem because
the people who drop out might be different in some important way from those who stay in. Maybe the less successful grads drop out or the ones who move away. If that happens, your remaining sample isn't representative of the original group anymore. It introduces bias.
okay. Makes sense. other issues?
Well, they're also just more expensive and time-consuming to run. Keeping track of people for years is hard work. And there's also the possibility of conditioning effects. People might start answering differently just because they're being asked the same questions repeatedly.
Right. They become too aware of the study.
Exactly. The notes also briefly mention trend versus cohort studies. Trend studies track changes in a general population over time, but use different samples each time. Like political polls tracking approval ratings year after year, different people surveyed each time.
Got it.
Cohort studies track a specific group, like our class of 2013, but might still use different samples from that cohort at each time point. The key distinction the notes make is that trend and cohort studies, done this way with different samples, are often still considered cross-sectional in nature at each time point. It only becomes truly longitudinal, or a panel study, if you follow the exact same individuals from the cohort.
Okay, so cross-sectional dot snapshot groups now. Longitudinal dot movie, same individuals over time, but watch out for dropouts.
That's a great way to put it. The timing and who you measure directly shape the questions you can answer about change.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to the tools for collecting data, specifically surveys. The notes really hammered that point. Surveys are often used in non-experimental work, but they're fundamentally a method.
Right, a crucial distinction. A survey is just a structured way to ask questions. You could use a survey in an experiment, maybe a pre-test and post-test survey around an intervention.
Sure.
But they're the backbone of so much non-experimental research. And the absolute key, as the notes say, is the quality of the data you get from that survey.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A badly designed survey gives you junk data no matter how interesting your research question was.
So good questionnaire design is everything. What do the notes suggest are the key things to look for?
They give some really practical guidelines. When you encounter survey results, you should ask, were the questions really related to the research problem? Were they clear, or could people interpret them differently?
Ambiguity is bad.
Very bad. Did each question stick to one single idea? Or was it a double-barreled question asking two things at once?
Yeah, I hate those.
Were there leading questions, nudging people towards an answer? Did they think about social desirability bias?
Yeah.
People answering to look good rather than honestly? Were the response options clear and exhaustive? Did they cover all the likely answers? Simple language, avoid jargon, avoid double negatives. It sounds basic, but getting these right is vital.
Absolutely. What about the format? Like multiple choice versus writing an answer?
The notes cover both. Selected response, like multiple choice or those Likert scales, the strongly agree to strongly disagree type things.
The 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 scales.
Right, 4, 5, or 7-point scales are common. And then open-ended questions where people write freely, each has its place. But one thing the notes really stress is doing a pilot run.
Testing it first.
Yes, test the survey on a small group that's similar to your target audience before you send it out widely. It costs time, maybe money, but it's the best way to catch confusing questions, bad formatting, or other problems.
So as a reader, asking if they piloted the survey is a good check on quality.
A very good check.
Okay, the notes also dug into response rate and response quality. This feels super important for deciding if we can trust the results.
Oh, it's absolutely critical. Response rate is simple. What percentage of the people you asked actually completed and returned the survey?
And what's a good rate?
Well, the notes mention 70% is often cited as a target, but honestly, in many real-world surveys, especially online or mail ones, it can be much, much lower.
Okay.
Then there's response quality. Did people answer completely? Thoughtfully. But the big worry related to response rate is non-response bias.
Non-response bias. That's when the people who don't answer are different.
Exactly. If the people who ignored your survey or refused to take it are systematically different from the ones who did respond, maybe they're less interested or busier or hold different opinions, then your results don't truly represent the whole group you wanted to study.
Right. So if only the really passionate people respond.
Your results will look skewed. So when you see survey findings, always look for the response rate and ask yourself, is it possible the non-respondents were different in a way that matters? The notes mention strategies researchers use to boost rate professional look, maybe small incentives, clear deadlines, follow-up reminders.
But what about bad data? People skipping questions, or just clicking agree on everything, or giving obviously fake answers. How do researchers handle that?
Good question. The notes say you can't just assume non-respondents are random. You should try to understand why people didn't respond, maybe by looking at demographics if you have them, or even trying to interview a small sample of the non-responders.
Oh,
For data that is submitted but looks bad, like lots of skipped questions or weird patterns you have to investigate, look for patterns of incompleteness. Are people consistently skipping sensitive questions and dishonest responses? The notes argue they can actually be worse than no response at all because they actively distort the data.
how do you spot dishonest answers?
Sometimes it's obvious impossible answers, like saying you work 200 hours a week. Other times it's patterns, like someone agreeing with every single statement, even contradictory ones. That's called acquiescence bias.
The naysayers.
Right. And then there's handling missing data. What do you do when someone skipped a few questions?
Yeah, what do you do?
First, check how much is missing. The note suggests maybe 5–10% might be acceptable depending on the context. Then you have options. Deletion is one.
Just remove them.
You can do list-wise deletion, remove anyone who missed any question from the analysis. Or pairwise deletion, only remove them for the specific calculation that uses the variable they missed. Pairwise is generally better because you keep more data overall.
Okay.
The other approach is imputation, statistically estimating and filling in a plausible value for the missing data.
Filling it in, doesn't that feel iffy?
It requires making assumptions, absolutely, and the notes are clear. You shouldn't just blindly impute. You first need to analyze why the data is missing. Is it random or is there a pattern? Imputation is complex, but sometimes necessary to avoid losing too much data or introducing bias from just deleting cases. The key is transparency about how it was done.
Wow. So much goes into just getting a clean data set from a survey. What about online surveys? They're everywhere now.
They are indeed. The notes mention platforms like SurveyMonkey. The big pluses are speed and convenience, obviously.
Yep.
But there are downsides. Potential legitimacy questions: are people really who they say they are? Not everyone has equal access to or comfort with technology. And interestingly, some research shows that people might answer certain types of questions differently online versus on paper. So researchers need to think carefully. Does my target population have good access? How will I handle follow-ups? Is this the best mode for my questions?
And the notes hinted at the future here, something beyond just clicking buttons online.
Yeah, this was fascinating. They see online surveys evolving into more like computerized assessments, using sensors,
Sir.
like tracking eye movements as someone reads a question, analyzing voice patterns, maybe even using data from virtual reality interactions. The idea is to collect richer, potentially more objective data than just relying on what people choose to type or click.
That sounds like a huge shift, moving away from self-report.
It could be a very different way of gathering information.
Okay, let's touch on interviews too. The notes cover them as another key data collection method. What are the advantages of talking to someone directly versus just giving them a questionnaire?
Interviews have some real strength. Often you get better response rates. It feels more personal, harder to just ignore someone asking for your time.
Sure.
You can also clarify things. If someone gives a vague answer, the interviewer can probe gently, ask for more detail. That's harder with a static questionnaire.
Good point.
And if you train your interviewers well and use a standardized script, you can get pretty consistent data while still allowing that flexibility. Plus, they can be more inclusive for people who might struggle with reading or writing. Think about big national surveys on health or social issues, often done via interview.
The notes mention standardizing procedures and training. Why is consistency so critical?
You want to minimize interviewer effects. The way one interviewer asks a question, their tone, even their body language, shouldn't make someone answer differently than they would with another interviewer.
So the interviewer themselves doesn't become a source of bias.
Exactly. The notes describe the ideal interviewer as friendly but businesslike. Keep it professional, stick to the script for the core questions, record answers accurately.
What about phone interviews?
They have pros and cons too. Often cheaper and easier to reach people across wide areas than face-to-face. Maybe less intimidating for some topics.
But downsides?
Can be tiring for both parties if it's long. Maybe less ideal for really sensitive topics where anonymity feels more comfortable. And again, the notes mention the lines blurring with online methods, video calls, etc. There's even talk of using automated machine or computer interviews for initial screening or very standard question sets.
Interesting. And I guess that selection bias issue comes up again.
Always. The people who agree to sit down for an interview, whether face-to-face or phone, might just be different from those who say no. More outgoing, more time, stronger opinions. It's an inherent challenge you have to acknowledge.
Okay, so finally, the notes wrap up by discussing sources of error. This seems to tie everything together, all the things that can go wrong in collecting this non-experimental data.
Exactly. Understanding where error can creep in is fundamental to judging data quality. The notes mentioned the response effect.
Response effect.
Just the general tendency for people to sometimes give inaccurate info. Maybe they misunderstand the question. Maybe they don't remember accurately. Maybe they want to present themselves in a certain light. A good interviewer might be able to spot some of this confusion, unease, but it's always a risk.
Right.
And conceptually, the notes break error down into two main types. First, there's systematic error, which is also called bias.
Bias.
This is error that pushes results consistently in one direction. You're systematically measuring something other than what you intended, like that scale always reading 5 pounds high. Or a survey question worded in a way that subtly encourages agreement from everyone. It's a validity problem.
Okay, consistent error. What's the other type?
Unsystematic error or random error. This is also called unreliability.
Unreliability.
This is inconsistency or lack of precision, like the scale giving slightly different readings each time. It's noise in the data, maybe ambiguous questions that different people interpret differently, or just random fluctuations in mood or attention. It's a reliability problem.
So systematic error affects accuracy. Unsystematic error affects precision.
That's a great way to think about it. And connecting this to the bigger picture, the whole point of careful research design, good instrument construction, interviewer training, all of it, especially in non-experimental studies where you already have challenges with causal claims, is to minimize both types of error as much as possible. You want data that is both accurate, free from bias, and precise, reliable, and consistent. And the notes circle back to the future again, suggesting that new tech might offer creative ways to get closer to that goal.
Wow, okay. That was definitely a deep dive. We covered a lot of ground. Defining non-experimental research, that whole feasibility versus validity trade-off.
Right, and the different types, correlational versus causal comparative.
Yeah, why correlation isn't causation. Then how collecting data over time, cross-sectional versus longitudinal, changes what you can learn about change.
The snapshot versus the movie.
Exactly. And then we really got into the weeds of surveys and interviews, designing good questions, the nightmare of non-response bias, handling messy data, online methods.
And finally, thinking about the types of errors that can undermine the whole process. It all connects.
So, thinking about all this, what does it really mean for you, the listener, when you're reading a news article about some study or seeing poll results?
It means activating that research detector we talked about, especially if it's not a randomized controlled experiment, which most social research isn't.
Okay.
Your detector should be asking questions. How did they get these participants? Was it a snapshot or did they follow people? If it was a survey, what was the response rate? Could the non-responders be different? How do they handle missing info? Are they claiming cuz when they only showed a link? Understanding these basic design and data collection issues helps you gauge the strength of the evidence. It helps you see the limitations, the potential biases, and evaluate how much weight you should really give those conclusions.
Exactly. It's about being a more critical, more informed consumer of information, not just accepting the headline at face value.
Which really makes you wonder, given all these challenges we've discussed, the difficulty of getting perfect samples, avoiding non-response bias, measuring things accurately without experimental control, how much imperfection should we actually tolerate? Like, especially with sensitive topics or really bold claims based on non-experimental data, what's the threshold? How low can that response rate be, or how much data can be missing before we really need to question if the findings are meaningful at all?
That's a really tough question. Something definitely worth thinking about as you encounter research out in the world. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive today.